The slide with my name on it disappeared before I even finished my sentence. 1 second. I was outlining risk exposure for a $280 million auction. The next. The screen flickered black, and Damon Ives leaned back in his chair like he'd just solved a math problem. "Compliance is a cost center," he said, loud enough for all 27 executives in the room to hear. "We need velocity, not caution." He looked at me as if I were an outdated software update. "This legacy drag thinking," he continued, tapping the table, "is exactly what's holding us back." A few of them avoided eye contact. A few smirked. Damon didn't blink. "I'm telling you this from Chicago, Illinois, a city that knows the cold winds and chilly boardrooms all too well. Where are you listening from? I'm glad you're here. If you're still watching that short performance, please leave your lucky number in the comments. We might need it. Do you know? 17 years. That's how long I had been head of regulatory compliance. I built the auction classification framework when this company first stepped into high-value asset sales. I negotiated the oversight protocols. I drafted the disclosure language banks now relied on. I was the guardrail nobody noticed until someone tried to drive through it. Damon was 38, fresh from private equity, confident that laws were guidelines with flexibility. He liked disruption. He liked shortcuts more. He didn't like me. HR escorted me out before the meeting ended. No severance discussion, no transition plan, just a badge deactivation and a polite smile that said, "You're yesterday's news." By evening, my inbox chimed. The sender was our primary financing bank. Subject line, classification, confirmation required. Immediate review. The auction Damon had been so eager to accelerate had just been reclassified as a private discretionary event. My stomach tightened. That classification didn't match the asset structure. It didn't match the funding agreement. It didn't match reality. I opened the attached document. There it was. Approval signature Damon Ives. Velocity. Apparently, came with a pen. And that's where the real story begins. What you're about to hear is a blend of real-life experience with a few fictional elements and a bit of I intended only to highlight emotions and clarify lessons, not to target any real individuals or organizations. I hope it resonates with you. And if it doesn't, that's okay too. Close the tab. Get some rest. Take care of yourself. Humiliation would have been easier to swallow if Damon had stopped at firing me. He didn't. The next morning, he announced to the entire executive team that the upcoming $280 million auction would be reclassified as a private discretionary event. The move conveniently eliminated public compliance disclosure and shaved $1.8 million off projected oversight costs. "Regulators don't run companies. CEOs do," he said. Standing at the head of the table, I used to brief. Several people nodded like it was gospel. A few glanced at me through the glass wall, already erased but still present enough to blame. Damon framed it as bold leadership. I knew it as exposure. The asset structure required enhanced transparency under the financing agreement. Reclassifying it wasn't innovation. It was gambling with someone else's money. I watched the internal memo circulate. My name was removed from every approval chain. My prior warnings were archived without comment. It wasn't just a shortcut. It was a public declaration that caution was weakness and experience was obstruction. 2 days later, the bank responded. They invoked the mandatory independent review clause embedded in the funding contract. The reclassification triggered automatic third-party oversight before any capital could be released. $42 million would remain frozen pending review. By late afternoon, my phone rang. The bank's compliance director spoke carefully. They needed a certified regulatory specialist with direct knowledge of the company's auction framework. Someone independent, someone qualified. They asked if I would serve as the external auditor. The bank's call offering me the role of independent auditor was only the beginning. What followed was quieter, colder, and far more consequential, within hours of their notice. The financing agreement was pulled from digital archives and circulated among the board. Buried in Section 14 was what the bank formally referenced as the trigger clause. If an auction exceeding $100 million was misclassified under disclosure standards, The company was required to obtain monthly certification from a credentialed compliance specialist previously registered in the original oversight framework. No certification, no capital release. The auction Damon had reclassified sat at $280 million. The clause wasn't theoretical, it was automatic. Once the bank determined the classification shift materially altered disclosure exposure, the funding schedule changed status. $42 million in staged financing moved from pending to suspended, and the certification could not come from in-house counsel. It had to come from the original architect of the regulatory matrix attached to the financing approval. There was only one name registered under that matrix. Mine. Damon tried resistance first. He argued that the reclassification was strategic, not material. He suggested interim documentation would satisfy the bank. The response came back in writing absent certified monthly confirmation from the registered compliance officer. The freeze would remain in effect. $42 million does something to corporate confidence. Treasury recalculated liquidity projections. The board requested an emergency briefing. Legal asked for my prior warning memos. The ones Damon had dismissed as legacy drag. He refused to call me that day. Instead, he instructed outside counsel to locate an alternative signatory. They reviewed credentials, cross-checked filings, and came back with the same answer. The certification requirement referenced the original regulatory framework author. I wrote it. By Friday afternoon, vendor payments were being delayed to preserve cash buffers. Analysts began asking about funding timelines. Nothing had collapsed, but the pressure was measurable. That was when my phone lit up. Damon Ives. This time, he wasn't speaking to a cost center. He was calling the clause he triggered. When Damon called, I let it ring twice before answering. Not out of pettiness, out of calibration. The leverage had shifted, and I intended to treat it with the precision it deserved. He skipped the small talk. We need to resolve the certification issue, he said, voice controlled but tight. Not, I need you back. Not even, we made a mistake. Just a problem to be solved. I'm not returning as an employee. I replied. My tone was even, almost courteous. If the bank requires monthly certification, it will be under an independent consulting agreement. There was a pause. Then, legal joined the call. By the end of that afternoon, terms were drafted. $45,000 per month. Payment in advance. Full independence from executive direction. Unrestricted access to all auction-related documentation, communications, and bidder records. No performance metrics. No reporting line to the CEO. My obligation was to the certification standard, not to Damon Ives. He signed without looking at me during the in-person execution of the contract. The board insisted the agreement be formalized quickly to lift the $42 million freeze. Treasury could only stretch liquidity so far. This won't last, Damon muttered as he initialed the final page. I held his gaze. Compliance always does. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. 2 days earlier, I had been escorted out as obsolete. Now my signature determined whether capital flowed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The contract restored structure. It did not restore trust. Once the agreement cleared, I submitted my first formal request under the access clause. Not summaries, not executive briefings, complete bidder files, ownership disclosures, communication logs, side letters, affiliated entities. Damon stiffened. That's excessive. It's required for certification, I said. Silence settled over the room. He could refuse, but refusal would maintain the freeze. I wasn't back to save his velocity. I was there to measure it, and measurement begins with data. If you agree with how I handled it, refusing to return as an employee, and demanding full independent access before signing anything, drop a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. Because every opinion shapes how stories like this are understood. Access changes everything. Once the bidder files began arriving in full, the narrative Damon had been selling, efficient, streamlined, visionary, started to look incomplete. I approached the review the way I always had, line by line. Ownership tree by ownership tree. High-value auctions are rarely simple. Shell entities sit behind holding companies, which sit behind limited partnerships. None of that is illegal. Complexity alone is not corruption, but patterns matter. One bidder, Armitage Holdings, flagged my attention. On paper, it was clean registered entity, disclosed principles, capital verification in place. Yet when I traced the investment chain back through two intermediary funds, I found a familiar name. The private investment group that had previously co-invested with Damon during his hedge fund years held a minority stake in one of Armitage's upstream vehicles. Not criminal, not even automatically disqualifying, but it was undisclosed, under the financing agreement. Any material relationship between executive leadership and participating bidders required declaration prior to classification as a private event. The exposure wasn't proof of wrongdoing. It was undeclared conflict risk. I documented the linkage carefully, attaching public filings, cross-referenced ownership charts, and timestamps. Then I submitted a preliminary report to the bank's compliance division, outlining the relationship and recommending enhanced disclosure review before certification. Damon called within the hour. "You're stretching this," he said. "That fund invests everywhere. Then disclosure protects everyone." I replied. He attempted to narrow my access the next day. IT informed me that certain internal communications folders were being reorganized. I forwarded the consulting agreement to General Counsel. The clause was explicit, unrestricted access to all auction-related data and communications necessary for certification. Access was restored within minutes. Tension doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like spreadsheets and controlled voices. The board remained outwardly calm, but Treasury continued monitoring the frozen $42 million. Every delay increased pressure. 3 days after my preliminary submission, the bank responded. They weren't satisfied with a limited scope review, given the undisclosed relationship and the recent reclassification decision. They were expanding the audit framework beyond the current auction. The review would now include the company's prior 5 years of auction classifications and related disclosures. 5 years. The room didn't erupt. It tightened. What had begun as a shortcut was becoming a history lesson. Within a week of the bank widening its review to 5 years of auction classifications, our corporate liability insurer requested updated disclosures. My preliminary findings, now formally logged, altered the company's risk profile. Exposure, even potential exposure, changes underwriting assumptions. The adjustment arrived in a 3-page notice, effective immediately. The company's directors' and officers' liability premium would increase by $130,000 per month pending completion of the expanded audit. $130,000. Monthly. Unlike frozen funding, insurance premiums are not theoretical. They are wired. Treasury recalculated again. The $42 million freeze was still in place. Now, operational overhead was rising in parallel. Liquidity modeling shifted from temporary inconvenience to compressed runway. The board convened an emergency session. Damon entered that meeting with the same confidence he'd displayed when he called me obsolete. He framed the premium increase as an overreaction by conservative underwriters. He suggested the insurer was pricing noise. Then someone asked a simple question. What triggered the reassessment? Silence followed before legal answered. The expanded audit and undeclared conflict exposure had obligated notification under policy terms. My report was cited directly. By the end of the week, the market noticed. Analysts revised their outlook from stable to cautious. The stock declined 12% in 5 trading days. Not catastrophic, but sharp enough to generate headlines. Damon called me afterward. "You're over-reporting," he said. "You're escalating routine issues. I'm documenting material risk." I replied, "The contract requires it." He accused me of damaging shareholder value. I reminded him that reclassification without disclosure triggered the review in the first place. Pressure rarely announces itself. It accumulates. Board members who once applauded speed began asking about governance controls. Treasury outlined the compounded monthly burden, frozen funding, plus elevated insurance premiums. Every week of delay had a price tag. During the next board session, One director, quiet until then, leaned forward. We need to evaluate whether this leadership approach is aligned with our fiduciary obligations, she said. It wasn't a motion, not yet, but it was the first time someone questioned Damon's role out loud. The penalty wasn't just financial anymore, it was positional. The next board meeting felt different before it even began. The energy in the room wasn't loud or hostile. It was quiet, controlled, calculating. Silence can be far more dangerous than outrage. I was invited to present a structured timeline. No theatrics, just documentation. I began with the initial classification memo I had circulated 3 weeks before the auction reclassification. In it, I outlined why the asset structure triggered enhanced disclosure under the financing agreement. I had flagged the potential risk of moving it into a private discretionary category without prior bank consultation. Next, I displayed the follow-up email I sent 2 days later when no response came. The language was clear, professional, direct. I recommended maintaining public classification until written lender confirmation was secured. Then, I advanced to the document that mattered most, the reclassification approval. Damon's signature sat beneath the revised category. After that, I projected the relevant excerpt from the financing agreement, the trigger clause, requiring certified monthly compliance confirmation if a material misclassification occurred. I did not editorialize. I did not accuse. I let the sequence speak. Email warning, follow-up memo, reclassification approval, funding freeze, insurance penalty. The room remained silent. One board member adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "You were warned," she said. Looking directly at Damon, he attempted to respond. He characterized my memos as overly cautious interpretations. He argued that executive discretion included strategic reclassification authority, but the documentation was chronological, time-stamped, and internally archived. The discussion shifted from auction mechanics to governance responsibility. Questions moved beyond classification and into process. Why had legal not escalated the warning? Why had Treasury not been consulted? Why had the board not been informed before the reclassification? No one raised their voice. That was the unsettling part. By the end of the session, a resolution was proposed, the formation of an internal audit committee with authority to review executive decision-making related to regulatory exposure. It passed without objection. No applause, no confrontation, just a structural change. The shift had begun. 3 days after the committee's first session, the bank delivered another notice. The language was careful but unmistakable. If the expanded review uncovered evidence of intentional non-disclosure of material conflicts of interest, the matter could be referred to federal supervisory authorities for further evaluation. Could be referred. That phrase carries weight in corporate America. It did not accuse, it did not conclude. It simply outlined the next procedural step if thresholds were met. But the implication was clear: escalation beyond private contractual remedies was possible. The market reacted faster than the board. Within 48 hours of the disclosure update, the stock fell an additional 19%. Analysts cited governance uncertainty and regulatory exposure risk. Media outlets began framing the narrative around leadership judgment rather than auction mechanics. Damon attempted to regain control of the story. He authorized a press statement describing the audit as routine enhancement of transparency standards. He held a brief internal town hall, emphasizing confidence and continuity. His tone was steady, his messaging was rehearsed, but pressure alters posture. Questions from employees shifted from performance metrics to stability. Vendors inquired about payment timelines. Treasury began modeling contingency liquidity plans in case the funding freeze extended further. In the next board session, the conversation moved beyond classification errors. Directors reviewed the cumulative impact: frozen $42 million, increased insurance premiums, declining market valuation, and potential regulatory referral. No one mentioned ego. They discussed fiduciary duty. Damon argued that stepping aside would signal weakness to the market. One director responded that instability was already priced in. The vote was not theatrical, it was procedural, pending completion of the expanded audit. Damon Ives was asked to temporarily step back from day-to-day executive authority. He remained CEO in title, but not in control. The shadow had moved from the documents to the office. By the time the Internal Audit Committee completed its preliminary findings, Damon was no longer fighting the narrative, he was negotiating survival. The report did not accuse him of criminal conduct. It did something more dangerous. It documented a pattern of executive override without adequate disclosure. Combined with measurable financial fallout, a $42 million funding freeze, elevated insurance premiums, and a cumulative market loss exceeding 30% in 2 weeks. The bank's language grew sharper. Continued leadership under regulatory scrutiny, they suggested, could complicate any potential resolution. That was corporate shorthand for remove the risk factor. Damon resigned 3 days later. Officially, it was framed as a voluntary step to preserve organizational stability. Unofficially, it was containment. He requested a private meeting with me before the announcement became public. I agreed. He looked smaller across the conference table than he had the day he dismissed me. Not physically smaller, strategically smaller. We need to stabilize the certification timeline, he said. If you can expedite the next sign-off, it would help calm the market. Expedite, as if compliance were a delivery service. You called me outdated, I reminded him quietly. I was just inconvenient. He didn't respond. The contract governed my actions, not sentiment. I reviewed each disclosure update, verified each bidder clarification, and cross-checked each historical classification within the expanded 5-year scope. I signed when the documentation met the standard, not faster, not slower, exactly as required. The difference between retaliation and integrity is timing. I refused to weaponize the process. I also refused to soften it. When Damon's resignation was announced, the market reacted with cautious relief. The stock stabilized. The bank signaled willingness to consider phased restoration of the frozen funds pending continued certification. A week later, the board requested another meeting with me. This time, the tone was different, not defensive, not transactional. They acknowledged that the regulatory framework I built had prevented escalation beyond contractual remedies. They admitted that governance gaps had been exposed. Then they made an unexpected proposal. They asked whether I would consider serving on a newly established Governance and Risk Oversight Committee independent, reporting directly to the board, with authority to review executive decisions involving regulatory exposure. I had been removed as obsolete. Now they were asking me to help define the guardrails. For the first time since that boardroom dismissal, I allowed myself a breath that felt less restrained. After Damon stepped down and the governance committee was formalized, I did not celebrate. I reviewed documents. That was always the work. The expanded audit continued under structured timelines, and the bank gradually lifted portions of the $42 million freeze as certifications were completed without new findings. The next major auction was classified correctly from the beginning: enhanced disclosure, full bidder transparency, pre-clearance with financing partners. No shortcuts disguised as innovation. The process took longer. It also closed cleanly. Investors noticed. Confidence does not return in a headline. It returns in increments, stabilized forecasts, revised analyst notes, institutional funds increasing positions instead of trimming them. Within a quarter, the stock recovered the 19% regulatory drop and climbed beyond its pre-crisis level. Not because of spin, because the structure held. I did not destroy the company. I reinforced it. The new Governance and Risk Oversight Committee implemented clearer escalation protocols. Executive Reclassification Authority now required documented legal concurrence. Disclosure matrices were reviewed annually instead of reactively. My role remained independent. $45,000 per month, paid in advance, in exchange for certification grounded in documentation, not opinion. Damon left with a negotiated separation package and a reputation permanently qualified by the phrase under governance review. No indictment, no scandal headline, just a leadership tenure that ended under pressure he created. In the end, I understood something Damon never did. I wasn't outdated. I was the guardrail. And guardrails only seem unnecessary until you hit the edge. What stayed with me wasn't the humiliation. It was the realization that the quiet work matters more than the loud room. Policies I drafted years earlier, documents no one applauded, became the very structure that protected the company when leadership failed. That's the lesson. Competence doesn't shout. It accumulates. Integrity doesn't trend. It endures. If you were told you were outdated tomorrow, what would you lean on: reputation, relationships, or the systems you built when no one noticed? Think about that. Because moments of pressure don't create character, they reveal it. I'm sharing this from Chicago. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or state below. I read more of those than you'd think. And if this story resonates, here's the part that truly matters when you subscribe. Comment, like, or share. You're not boosting an algorithm, you're amplifying a mindset. Somewhere, someone is being dismissed for doing things the right way. Your engagement helps stories like this reach them. It might remind them not to compromise. It might push them to document that memo. It might change a decision at the exact moment it counts. That makes you part of the impact. So if you believe integrity deserves visibility, stay connected, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it. Leave your thoughts below. Small actions travel further than you think. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.